What if it wasn't the stars and stripes on the moon, but the hammer and sickle? What if America watched in silence as a Soviet cosmonaut saluted the world from the Sea of Tranquility, and NASA was shut down in shame days later? What if the greatest American dream was stolen, not by failure, but by betrayal from within? The truth was buried for decades, and when one man found it, what followed would unravel everything we thought we knew. But let's start at the beginning. Cody Wallace was 9 years old when he saw his father cry for the first time. It wasn't a funeral. It wasn't even a moment of personal loss. It was July 20th, 1969, a day that was supposed to be the greatest triumph in American history. Families across the United States had gathered around television sets in living rooms, school auditoriums, and public parks, eyes glued to flickering screens with tinny sound. Cody's family had invited the neighbors. Popcorn was in bowls. His little sister wore an American flag pin on her collar. But what they saw wasn't Neil Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface. Instead, the screen cut to grainy footage. It looked like a strange broadcast override, something no one recognized at first. But then came the voice. Not English, not American. It was Russian. The signal had been hijacked. On screen was a lone figure in a bulky white suit, climbing down a ladder onto the pale surface of the moon. The audio crackled, distorted by distance, but clear enough for a single, unmistakable phrase. "Ya, Pervi Chelovek na Lune." I am the first man on the moon. Cody's father, Frank Wallace, stood up so fast he knocked over the lamp. The living room plunged half into shadow. No one said a word. They just stared, frozen. The cosmonaut's name, revealed moments later by the voiceover from Moscow's Channel 1, was Anatoly Ivanovich. And behind him, shimmering against the desolate gray horizon of the Sea of Tranquility, was a red Soviet flag, its golden hammer and sickle unmistakable even through the poor resolution. No stars and stripes, no Armstrong, no giant leap, only silence. The next few hours were a blur. Every major U.S. broadcast channel scrambled to regain control of their feed, but the Soviet footage was already everywhere, mirrored by networks across Europe, Asia, South America. American broadcasters tried to confirm, deny, explain. But by dawn, NASA itself held a stunned press conference. Mission Control looked like a funeral home. No one smiled. No one denied the truth. The USSR had reached the moon first. And not only that, they had hidden their mission. It had launched weeks earlier, in total secrecy, from a remote cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The rocket, named Zorya 3, had used a redesigned launch profile, piggybacked off a modular orbiting station, and circumvented every American satellite that had been watching the skies. They hadn't just beaten America. They had outsmarted it. Cody couldn't understand everything that happened in the days that followed, but he would remember the sound of his father's weeping as clearly as the crackle of the Soviet transmission. Frank Wallace wasn't just a patriotic American. He was a propulsion engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. For the last 5 years, he had worked on the Saturn V thrust architecture, convinced he was helping write history. Instead, history had erased him in a single day. 3 days later, Frank came home with a cardboard box in his arms, his badge, his desk photos, some engineering notebooks. That night, Cody heard his parents arguing in the kitchen, not about the job, but about shame. Frank muttered something about being called a traitor to American pride by a protester outside the facility gates. Cody didn't know what that meant, but he felt its weight. A week after the moon landing, the Marshall facility was locked down, then decommissioned. By August, all development contracts were frozen. September brought waves of layoffs across Houston, Florida, and California. Congress began urgent hearings. The term space race disappeared from headlines and was replaced with space collapse. NASA tried to salvage dignity. Public statements insisted America would still reach beyond Earth, that this was only a pause. But the funding bled out like a slow wound. By spring of 1971, NASA was effectively dismantled. Its pieces, laboratories, launch pads, personnel, were quietly absorbed into defense or shuttered entirely. The iconic image became a wound in the nation's psyche. Anatoly Ivanovich, saluting under a flag that Americans had been taught to fear since kindergarten, with the vast black of space behind him. The Earth, small and suspended, rising above a red banner. The Soviets didn't just win, they staged their victory with merciless precision. Moscow declared July 20th an international holiday. Crowds filled Red Square. State media dubbed it Victory over Capitalism. Anatoly was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times in 1 week. And then came the map. In October 1969, Soviet officials presented a new version of the world map at the United Nations, not with force, but with flair. The USSR's borders were highlighted in bold red. Beneath it, a slogan: first on Earth, first in space, first on the moon. The American delegation walked out, but no one followed them. Cody's school changed too. The posters of rockets and astronauts came down. Textbooks were rewritten. Space was no longer a subject of inspiration, but of caution. The school principal addressed the students over the intercom a week later. There are times in history when we must learn from our defeats. This is one. The words didn't land, not really, but the silence in the halls did. And something else began creeping in. A sense of shame, not just among adults, but children. Cody stopped wearing his NASA t-shirt. His best friend Malcolm was told by his father not to mention that moon thing at church. Teachers avoided the subject entirely. Only once did one of them slip. Mrs. Cranston, the science teacher, whispered during a lesson, "We were ready. They just got there dirty." She never explained what she meant. She retired 2 weeks later. Back in Huntsville, the Wallace family tried to hold together. Frank spent hours in the garage, not working, just staring at engine blueprints he no longer had the authority to build. Cody would sometimes sit beside him in silence, tracing the outlines of the Saturn V booster cross-sections with his finger. "Do you think they'll let us try again?" he asked once. Frank didn't answer. He just looked away. America was unraveling, not in chaos, but in doubt. Confidence drained from every corner of its culture. Science fiction shows were canceled. Defense budgets pivoted away from space into ground-based surveillance. News anchors dropped their once glorious tone when talking about the future. And behind closed doors, as Cody would learn much later, a darker story was brewing. Whispers that America hadn't merely lost the moon, but had been stopped from reaching it. Not by rockets, by something far more insidious. But at 9 years old, Cody didn't know that yet. All he knew was the image that replayed over and over. A man not from his country, standing on the moon, waving a red flag. By the time Cody Wallace graduated from Huntsville High School in the spring of 1978, the America he had grown up in felt like a ghost of itself, proud, hollow-eyed, and limping through its own century. The blue in the flag seemed faded. The anthem, when played at assemblies, sounded more like a requiem than a song of triumph. Cody no longer saw kids wear space patches on their jackets or talk about becoming astronauts. That future had dried up like a cracked desert riverbed. What replaced it was quieter, more corrosive, a national fatigue, like the country had inhaled something toxic and never recovered. The economic situation didn't help. Stagflation gripped the economy. Gas prices surged. The job market was dismal, But it wasn't just about money. It was about self-worth. The dollar itself had started to carry less symbolic weight. Foreign markets began shifting away from it, not just in practice, but in sentiment. The moon was supposed to be a symbol of American ingenuity, and when that symbol was stolen, so was the narrative of American dominance. By 1976, the bicentennial year, the fireworks felt forced. Most major media outlets aired heavily censored retrospectives of 1969, carefully avoiding the red moon. Meanwhile, footage of Anatoly Ivanovich planting the Soviet flag was being re-aired every year in Eastern Europe, complete with triumphant orchestration and lines of children saluting in red scarves. America's allies began drifting. France, led by a younger, post-Gaullist generation, signed economic and scientific cooperation treaties with the USSR. West Germany followed, its chancellor giving a speech in 1977 about a multipolar future built on mutual achievement. Britain resisted for a while, but by 1979, even London sent envoys to attend Soviet tech expos in Minsk. The fracture of NATO came quietly, not in explosions, but in absences, fewer joint exercises, delays in commitments. Talks stalled, and behind every hesitation there lingered the unspoken truth. America had promised to lead humanity beyond the earth, and failed. Cody enrolled in the University of Alabama, intending to study political science. But the curriculum had changed since the 60s. Courses on American international leadership were replaced with classes like post-hegemonic diplomacy and new centers of global influence. Professors spoke about détente with the USSR as not just pragmatic, but aspirational. "We must learn from our rivals," one said in class. "They succeeded where we faltered." That statement stayed with Cody, not because it was false, but because no one questioned it. By the early 80s, Soviet cultural influence was no longer just political, it was embedded. In film, in music, in education. American studios, struggling with investor pullouts, were forced into co-productions. The biggest blockbuster of 1981 wasn't made in Hollywood. It was Red Horizon, a Kremlin-backed dramatization of the Soviet lunar landing, made with joint Polish and East German cinematographers. The film won awards in Berlin, Paris, and Rio. In it, Anatoly Ivanovich was portrayed as a stoic, almost monastic figure, a man of the people, humble in his triumph. In the film's final scene, he gazes at Earth from the moon, a tear forming behind his helmet glass as a child's voice sings a Russian lullaby. The subtext was clear. The Soviets had not only conquered space, but had done so with a soul America had lost. American films, by contrast, struggled. Distributors in Europe pulled several major releases for being culturally one-sided, or historically tone-deaf. A sci-fi film about an American Mars colony was protested in Norway for ignoring real space history. It never made it past the second weekend in theaters. The final insult came in 1981. That year, the United Nations quietly announced its decision to relocate its central headquarters from New York City to Geneva. The official reason was geographic neutrality and logistical efficiency. But the subtext was unmistakable. The world no longer saw America as the capital of global discourse. And worse, America had begun to believe it too. The protests that followed weren't the rallies of the 1960s. Energetic, chaotic, full of youth and fury. These protests were tired, anxious. Elderly veterans of past marches stood next to unemployed steelworkers, waving signs that read, "We were first in heart," and "Bring back the dream." But it was clear they didn't believe it anymore. Cody, now 21, had returned to Huntsville after college and taken up substitute teaching while applying to grad school. The Marshall Space Flight Center, where his father once worked, had been converted into a military drone research facility. A massive mural that had once depicted the Saturn V rocket now showed an unmanned orbital surveillance platform, no human in sight. He taught history at a crumbling high school. The American flag in his classroom hung by one corner, torn along the edge. No one had the budget to replace it. His students were bright, curious, but strangely disconnected from the past. They spoke of the moon like a museum artifact. Some of them didn't even know the U.S. had once tried to land there. One day, during a lesson on Cold War tensions, a girl named Jenna Martinez raised her hand. She was the kind of student who always sat in the front row, always carried a notepad full of neat blue ink, and never spoke unless she had something sharp to say. "Mr. Wallace?" she asked. "Did we ever even have a chance?" The class fell quiet. Cody felt everyone looking at him, waiting, like he held some forgotten key. He opened his mouth, closed it, thought of his father, of that day in July, of the silence. "I don't know," he said finally. And that was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. But the Soviets weren't done. In 1983, they announced the successful deployment of 2 robotic probes to Mars. The missions, codenamed Pravda-1 and Pravda-2, broadcast images of the Martian surface in real time to a global audience. The quality was stunning, the signals stable. And on the 3rd day of the Pravda-2 stream, Soviet scientists claimed they had detected trace signatures of microbial life in a Martian crater. The announcement was made during a special UN Science Assembly in Geneva. The American delegation wasn't even present. The news sent tremors through the American public. Late-night shows mocked NASA's closure. Guess the Reds found more than just rocks on Mars. They found purpose. Editorials questioned whether the U.S. had lost not just a race, but a generation's reason to believe in itself. Cody watched it all from the teacher's lounge, sipping instant coffee from a stained mug. The TV was mounted high on the wall. A Soviet scientist explained the findings in accented English, standing before a crowd of cheering international delegates. Someone in the lounge muttered, "Maybe we never deserved it." Cody said nothing. He simply stared at the screen, trying to remember what it felt like to expect something miraculous from the stars. He couldn't. It was raining in Seattle on July 20th, 1989. Exactly 20 years after the world had watched a Soviet cosmonaut salute Earth from the moon. The anniversary was marked quietly in most of America. No speeches, no broadcasts, just a commemorative article buried on page 11 of the Washington Post, dry and bitter. 2 decades since the red flag rose. But for Cody Wallace, it was a day that would ignite something long extinguished. He hadn't taught in nearly 5 years. Journalism, surprisingly, had become his refuge, not in the mainstream, but in the rough, messy corners of local press where real stories still lived. He was an editor for a fringe Seattle paper called The Cascade Ledger, a weekly digest that ran investigative pieces on corrupt real estate deals and missing budgets in City Hall. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't seen. But it was honest work. And for Cody, it was enough. Until the file arrived. It came in a nondescript yellow envelope dropped into the newsroom mailbox without return address. Inside was a manila folder marked in faded typewritten ink. Apollo Prime, stoppage order, June 1969. Cody felt his fingers tremble before he even opened it. There were 5 pages, all of them copies, crisp reproductions of what looked like high-level internal memos from NASA's headquarters in 1969. The paper was thick, stamped in the upper margins with security markings and a barely legible watermark. But it was the signatures that froze him in place. Henry Kissinger, James Webb, Richard Nixon. The language was clinical, deceptively calm. Words like containment, mutual optics, and priority reassignment threaded through the paragraphs. But the meaning was unmistakable. According to the document, Apollo 11, The mission the world believed had failed to launch was, in fact, fully operational and ready for deployment. The Saturn V was prepped. The crew was cleared. Flight control had rehearsed. And then it was canceled, 2 weeks before launch. The order had come from the highest levels of government. A coordinated directive passed through the National Security Council, not NASA's own leadership. It called for strategic delay and referenced the risk of global destabilization should the USSR's concurrent mission be compromised. One line, circled in black ink by the anonymous sender, chilled Cody to the core. One lost moon is better than one lost planet. He sat back in his chair, heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't defeat. This was surrender. The next few days blurred into obsession. Cody worked from his apartment, lights off, blinds drawn, combing through the file for any reference points he could cross-check. He began pulling at threads, old press bulletins, budget records, engineering logs. At first it felt like chasing ghosts, but then he found the first crack. A declassified procurement record that showed a multi-million-dollar contract for lunar module components still paid out in full after the cancellation of Apollo 11. The official narrative was that the hardware had been recycled for Apollo 12. But Cody spoke to a former contractor who quietly admitted under anonymity that nothing was ever reused. It was stored or destroyed. The man's voice shook as he spoke. He refused to say more. Then came the journals. Retired NASA staff had left behind personal writings, letters to spouses, faded notebooks tucked away in garage boxes. Cody flew to Arizona to visit the widow of Neil Puckett, a mission planner who had died in 1982. She showed him a half-burned diary entry dated June 27, 1969. "It's over. Not because of them. Because of us. They said it was necessary. That a red flag on the moon was better than a red sky over D.C. She thought it was metaphor. Cody knew better. He reached out to his former contacts in Huntsville. Most were dead or untraceable. One, a former telemetry analyst named Gerald Kessler, agreed to meet him, on one condition: no recordings, no notes, no names. In a smoky diner off I-5, Gerald leaned in and whispered, "We knew. Not all of us, but enough. Orders came down fast, quiet. They locked us out of our own consoles. Told us it was a systems issue. But it wasn't. They just didn't want us to see the rocket sitting there doing nothing." Cody asked him why. Gerald exhaled slowly, like a man removing a confession from his lungs after 20 years. "Because we weren't supposed to win. Not that round. Not if it meant nuclear escalation. The Soviets launched secretly. If we'd launched anyway, someone would have pushed the wrong button." Cody compiled everything: the memos, the testimonies, the references. It wasn't just a story. It was the story. A secret buried beneath patriotic shame and Cold War diplomacy. America had been ready to win. But someone at the top had decided it was too risky. The risk wasn't in failure. It was in victory. He wrote the piece over 3 days. No editor, no approvals. Just him, a typewriter, and a city that had stopped believing in truth. On July 25th, the Cascade Ledger ran the article on the front page. "The Moon We Never Took. Was Apollo 11 sabotaged from within?" It sold out in hours. Then came the silence. By 6:00 a.m. the next morning, federal agents arrived at the newspaper's office with sealed warrants. The presses were shut down. Boxes of printed issues were confiscated. Cody's editor, a man named Bruce Tallman, was detained and released without explanation. No charges. No interviews. Cody's apartment was searched that night. He wasn't home. He'd gone into hiding. But what the government hadn't anticipated, what they couldn't erase, was the digital copy. Before submitting the piece to print, Cody had uploaded a PDF of the article and source files to a backdoor forum known to him from a college friend, a rudimentary bulletin board hosted on a Norwegian server. Within hours, the file was mirrored, then reposted, then translated. By the end of the week, it was circulating through underground networks across Europe, Canada, and the American coasts. Activists in Berlin printed excerpts and taped them across embassy walls. A rogue radio station in Argentina read the entire article on air. The Pentagon issued no statement. NASA, now a hollowed-out administrative agency dealing with satellite maintenance, offered only no comment. But the people, they remembered. For the first time in decades, Americans felt something close to outrage. Not at the Soviets, not even at failure, at betrayal. Talk shows debated the veracity of the documents. Retired generals went on air to say, "It wouldn't surprise me." Protesters gathered in D.C. with signs that read, "It was ours." Cody, still underground, watched it all from borrowed televisions and sleepless motel rooms. His source, the one who had mailed the file, was arrested 2 weeks later at a train station in Sacramento. No charges were filed. He was never seen again. But the file lived on. So did the question. What kind of nation trades the moon for fear? The world in 2009 looked nothing like the one Cody Wallace had grown up in. From orbiting news satellites that beamed state-controlled broadcasts to every screen on Earth, to biometric passports issued by the Geneva Coalition Authority, the symbols of the old United States had faded from global consciousness like the ink of a forgotten language. Children in schools across Eurasia learned their first programming languages in Russian. International science journals were published in Mandarin by default. The global space station, christened Zoraya 9, was operated under a joint Sino-Soviet agreement, with English only available through optional subtitles on official transmissions. Cody had spent the last 2 decades living in what people called the faded borderlands of memory. He had no interest in politics anymore. He didn't watch the international broadcasts. He no longer wrote. The government had stopped hunting him long ago, or perhaps they had simply erased his relevance. Either way, he had grown invisible. But he had one thing left, one final act. It was July 20th, 2009, the 40th anniversary of what was globally known as Red Moon Day. In Moscow, parades lined the streets, tanks rolled beneath iron-red banners, and holographic projections of Anatoly Ivanovich saluting from the Sea of Tranquility danced across skyscrapers. The original lunar footage had been reprocessed in Ultra HD. A new VR experience, backed by Huawei Mir Tech, allowed students to walk beside Anatoly on the moon. In America, there were no parades. But in a quiet field near the edge of Boulder, Colorado, a small group gathered. There was no podium, no cameras, just folding chairs, a thermos of black coffee, and a low wooden stake marking the center of the grass. Cody stood there, wrapped in a long tan coat, thinner than he'd ever been. His hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of memory. 7 people came. Some were former students. Some were strangers who had found the original PDF and followed digital whispers across forums. One of them, a young man with a wire in his jacket sleeve, looked like he was live streaming, but Cody didn't care. Among them stood a woman in her 30s, black hair tied back, eyes sharp beneath thick-rimmed glasses. She carried a small urn clutched to her chest. "Jenna," Cody said. She gave a soft nod. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Wallace." Jenna Martinez had become a data analyst in Berlin. Brilliant, focused, and watched constantly by her employer, a multinational satellite optimization firm funded by a Russian ministry. She had grown up in a family of Cuban dissidents. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had been imprisoned in 1995 for publishing a blog post titled, "The Moon Never Belonged to Them." He had died in prison. She had not spoken publicly about him since. Now she was here, and she wasn't the same girl who had once asked in class, "Did we ever even have a chance?" She didn't need to ask any more. She knew. The memorial wasn't formal. No one gave a speech. People sat quietly, listening to the soft rush of wind through tall grass and the occasional hiss of passing clouds. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the sky. Not to see stars, but to remember when they meant something. Cody waited until the sun dipped toward the horizon before stepping forward. He cleared his throat, more out of reflex than preparation. His voice was hoarse but steady. "They told us we were second," he began, not reading from anything. "They told us we were broken. But the truth?" He paused, looked at Jenna. "We were betrayed, not by rockets or rubles, but by fear. And we chose silence. For years. For decades." He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, worn and faded. He unraveled it carefully, as if exposing something sacred. It was a flag. The stars and stripes, dulled with age, the red almost rust-colored, the white now yellowed, the blue a deep navy. One corner was torn. The fabric was paper-thin from years of handling. He knelt slowly, groaning from stiff joints, and planted the flag into the soil beside the wooden stake. It barely stood, leaning slightly from the wind, but it held. "It's not the moon," Cody said, "but it's still ours." Jenna stepped forward, placed her father's urn next to the flag, and spoke for the first time. "My father died for a sentence," she said quietly. "A sentence that said the flag they showed us didn't belong there. I've read that sentence 1,000 times, and every time it feels like a knife and a promise." She turned to Cody. "Thank you for giving it meaning again." Later that evening, as the group dispersed, Cody remained. He sat in the grass beside the flag, watching the dark blue of night deepen into black. A satellite, probably Soviet, blinked across the sky. He thought about all the people who never saw the truth, the children who would never hear the name Apollo, the men and women who had vanished from the history books, not from failure, but from erasure. And yet, he didn't feel hopeless. What he had done, the truth he had unearthed, it had lived, even if just in fragments, in whispers, in defiant little memorials like this one. It had endured in people like Jenna, in quiet resistance, in memory, and in that frayed flag. He whispered to the sky, "You were ours. You always were." Across the world, few noticed. But in a subdomain buried deep in the architecture of an aging satellite uplink in Finland, an anonymous account posted a new message. 40 years. They still lie. But we still remember. # Apollo Prime Lives. It was mirrored within minutes. By dawn, it had been reposted in 200 languages. Somewhere, someone read it, and didn't look away.